Now that Mike Pompeo is to meet the parties to the Iran nuclear agreement that President Trump scuppered earlier this week, what, if anything, can the remainder of the coalition backing the deal achieve? And how will America's allies react to President Trump's unilateral action? And 10 years after the devastating earthquake that hit Wenchuan in Sichuan province, we'll be hearing from people affected in different ways by such tragedies, both as victims and in delivering aid. Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal threatens to scupper international efforts to constrain Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Although he offered no alternative policy to put it in its place, his move to reimpose sanctions on the country could have consequences that reach far beyond Iran, while at the same time he has put U.S. diplomacy on a collision course with some of Washington's closest allies. After returning from the DPRK on Thursday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is to embark on talks with allies in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East and Asia to try to persuade them to press Iran to curb its nuclear and missile programs. The open question is whether the allies, and above all Iran, will agree to resume any talks. The U.S. hope is that Iran will be dragged to the negotiating table by the resumption of U.S. sanctions, which would penalize European and other countries and likely cripple Iran's economy. So what could come out of these talks between Mike Pompeo and his counterparts, and what are the possibilities that any talks could take place in the near future? I'm joined by Professor Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran, and from Washington, Gareth Porter, an American historian, investigative journalist, author and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, while technically the deal can remain in place even after Washington pulls out, history would suggest that the administration may have a more ambitious goal to implode the agreement altogether. Professor Marandi, despite pleas by the leaders of Britain, Germany and France, the Trump administration has given no indication that it will exempt their banks and businesses from new sanctions, which could make it impossible for European countries to stay in the agreement. How come we have got to a position whereby the decision of one man can have such far-reaching effects on the rest of the world?
It is a dangerous situation. What Trump is basically doing is he's behaving like a global dictator. This agreement was something that was negotiated for a very long period of time. The Iranians were very flexible. They gave significant concessions. In fact, many people in Iran were deeply opposed to the agreement. But the Iranian side, ultimately, when they decided to agree to it, even those who opposed and those who, of course, supported it, all of them came together and they said we must abide by our commitments. What Trump did basically was he slapped the international community in the face, the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, and said that your efforts have no consequence, they are of no importance. And he's also now, after tearing the agreement, he is now threatening his own allies, and again Russia and China and others, not to disobey what I have dictated and not to do business with Iran. So this is a very dangerous situation. The European Union countries, they have been trying to appease Trump. When Macron went to Washington, he was publicly humiliated. We remember the dandruff incident, and despite his pleading and despite the fact that he basically was begging Trump not to leave the agreement, he was ignored, and the same happened with the German Chancellor. So if they want to seem relevant, both the EU and these countries, they have to grow a backbone and stand up to the United States. There is no other option. Otherwise, things will simply get worse across the globe.
Dr. Porter, now Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said Iran would negotiate with the 5 other signatories to the deal in the coming weeks, but he faces strong internal opposition from hardliners who want to leave the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So in your understanding, why is Iran giving the other parties a chance to keep the deal alive if the country's leaders know full well that it will not work with the U.S. on board, without the U.S. on board?
You know, that's a very good question. I think that the Iranian government at this point is really desperately clinging to any hope that this framework could continue to provide some kind of basis for working with the Europeans in particular. But you're absolutely right that there is a very strong pressure from the United States. Mohammed pointed this out, which is going to make that a very, very difficult proposition. And so I think that it is inevitable that we are going to see in the future a greater a separation between the European effort to try to save this agreement and the U.S. Basically insisting that the Europeans toe the line because of the extraterritorial sanctions that the United States plans to use as a lever or as a club really against the Europeans. I think the Europeans are going to it's going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the Europeans to really save this agreement. So for some period of time, I think this will play out, but eventually, in some months rather than years, I think we're going to see a reckoning that will inevitably lead to a much more dire situation in terms of international tensions.
Mm-hmm. Professor Marandi, some observers are talking about a more hardline and dangerous regime in Iran as a result of the U.S. move. What is your take?
Well, Iran obviously is not a regime. It's an Islamic republic. It has democratic institutions. There are checks and balances. And it's unlike American allies in the region, which are either family dictatorships or an apartheid regime that exists and subjugates the Palestinian people. And the Iranians have been abiding by international law, the Iranian nuclear program. As we've just heard a few weeks ago, Pompeo, when he was still the head of the CIA, he went in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and admitted that even before the nuclear deal, Iran was not moving towards a nuclear weapon. This is extraordinary. And this did not even make the news. So basically, he said this basically because he wanted to say, don't worry, if the U.S. pulls out of the agreement, Iran won't go for a nuclear weapon, because Iran wasn't doing so beforehand. But what he unwittingly did was he basically crushed the 15-year-old propaganda narrative of the United States that Iran was seeking a nuclear weapon. So Iran is vindicated. It shows that the United States knew before the agreement that Iran was not seeking a nuclear weapon. And now the Iranians have shown the international community that the United States, again, is the side that is unreliable and unfaithful. The Iranians, though, in order to show that they are not the side that wants to increase tensions, that wants to create a crisis, they gave a few extra weeks. Instead of pulling out immediately, which they could have done, they said, we'll give a few extra weeks to see what the international community can do. But the only way that Iran could possibly stay in the agreement at this point is if the European Union countries gave a solid commitment that they will stand up to the United States, they will protect their citizens, they'll protect their businesses, and they won't let the Americans intimidate them. Personally, I think the best option is for the foreign ministers of Germany, France, the UK to sit with the foreign minister of Iran and the foreign ministers of Russia and China together and to make a joint decision in order to put the U.S. president in his place. And I think this is especially important for countries like Russia and China, which are increasingly seeing U.S. antagonism, Russia facing sanctions, China a trade war. And so Trump should be forced to recognize that his powers are limited.
Dr. Porter, you said before that you have done the exclusive investigative work that has uncovered the facts that the evidence of an Iranian nuclear weapons program was fabricated by the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. What more could you tell us about that, and what are the responses or reactions you have been getting when you tell people, or tell the U.S. government, I suppose, the finding of your investigative work?
Well, this was an investigation that began for me back in 2007, 2008, and it resulted in my discovering that when you look carefully at these documents, which really were turned over to the Western intelligence by the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the Iranian terrorist organization. It was only taken off the terrorist list of the U.S. State Department in 2013. But the MEK, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, gave those documents, which were supposedly coming from the covert Iranian nuclear weapons research program from 2001 to 2003, turned them over to Western intelligence, which in turn gave them to the CIA. And the Bush administration then used those documents as the primary, I would say the exclusive evidence that Iran was indeed determined to get a nuclear weapon. Tried to get the IAEA for years to use them as the basis for essentially accusing Iran of such nuclear weapons ambitions, and was resisted by Mohammed al-Baradei, the Director General of the IAEA, for years, until the United States maneuvered into position the present Director General Amano from Japan, who had already been playing ball with the Bush administration. So basically what I found was that these documents could not have been produced by the MEK. They had to be produced by Mossad, the Israeli foreign intelligence organization. Mm-hmm. And what happened here was that the Iranian government in 2001 to 2003 was really playing a game of deception of the international community, leading them to believe that their Shahab-3 missile was going to be the missile of the future and was going to be mass-produced. And the Israeli intelligence fell for it. And therefore, the documents reflect the fact that they showed the nose cone of the Shahab-3 rather than the one that was actually being developed at that point by the Iranian Defense Ministry.
Professor Porter, Dr. Porter, I'm going to interrupt you here. Professor Marandi, you have about 30 seconds. What do you think is the credibility of Dr. Porter's finding, and what implications, if at all, will such finding have on the situation?
Well, his findings are very important. I've read his book, Manufactured Crisis, and I think everyone should read the book. It proves beyond doubt that the whole story of the nuclear program being a military program was false, and that the United States was simply using it as an excuse to put pressure on Iran. And as I pointed out earlier, Pompeo's recent admission as the head of the CIA confirms exactly what Gareth Porter said, although Pompeo said it for a very different reason.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Professor Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran and Dr. Gareth Porter, an American historian, investigative journalist and author and policy analyst from the United States. Now, a quick point from me, my personal commentary. I think the Trump administration has caught, not that I think they have, the United States has caught China and Russia revisionist countries who wish to disrupt the current Western-centric international order, a title which China rejects. However, what President Trump has done is exactly to disrupt the current order that was built after the Second World War based on multilateralism. Only when the U.S. does it, they think that it's fine because they think they are the guarantors of this order and have invested heavily in its outcome. But does that mean that the U.S. leadership can do whatever at their will, regardless of the consequences of their actions for the rest of the world? Such willfulness will slowly erode people's trust in the U.S. leadership and the order it has created, if it hasn't done so already. You're watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. On May 12th, China marks the 10th anniversary of a devastating earthquake that struck Wenchuan in its southwestern province of Sichuan. The quake left more than 69,000 people dead, nearly 18,000 missing, and millions homeless. 10 years on, how are the people affected doing now? What changes have they witnessed in terms of disaster relief and reconstruction? What lessons have been learned? I'm joined by Gwen from Chengdu, who who is head of the East Asia Regional Delegation of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And in the studio, I'm joined by Xiao Shiyao, who is a native of Wenchuan County, one of the worst-hit areas. He witnessed the quake as a 12-year-old, and Professor Fu Jing from the School of National Development at Peking University. Let me come to our guests in the studio first. Shiyao, you were in 6th grade when the earthquake struck. What happened? Do you still remember very clearly your experience back then?
So as you said, I was a primary school back then, and our class was supposed to start at 2:40 p.m. and at 2:28 I was at home checking my school bag and be about to leave. And at that moment, the earthquake broke out. And the first several seconds, I didn't know what happened. And I just heard my mother was yelling with panic, "Son, it's earthquake, come to the bathroom." So I struggled to move from my room to the bathroom.
And by the way, these are the pictures that you took at the moment when the earthquake struck?
Yeah, so it's just like 1 or 2 minutes after the earthquake.
Okay,
so
very dusty. Very dusty.
You could say that. So I will tell it later. And you say that, my mother held me, and we was in the bathroom. There was a little storeroom and our bathroom, and we could see that the wall was cracking and the floor was sagging down. So it was very torturing because you didn't know that whether the building will collapse, and you could do nothing to help yourselves out at that very situation. But I was not that scared at all because I was only 12-year-old and I knew little about earthquake, and I didn't know what the result it will be. But what really scary is after when we worked out, I saw those 2 pictures. So you can see that the sky was dusty and we couldn't see anything. The screaming, the people were screaming everywhere.
So, but fortunately, you escaped unhurt, your mother as well. But
lots of people there.
Yeah, in the people that you know, were there a lot of victims? Yeah, I suppose. So, 10 years on, looking back, what are the emotions at this moment?
So it's lots of emotions because you say that we as victims and see how we people to go through this 10 years from reconstruction. You know, we have built a completely new town in Beichuan. So lots of people's living standards are raising very quick and very, very fast and to a higher level. So we could never imagine before the earthquake. And what I really care about, and as a victim, I think is about the mental construction. Especially I saw lots of people lost their parents, lost their relatives, close friends. So there are and then even at that time when I walked through the road, I saw those beautiful buildings built after the earthquake. I would say that all these beautiful things were built at the price of thousands of people's lives. So it's kind of emotional flashbacks to those old faces.
Right, if you think about it.
Yeah, so.
And also, you mentioned that the quake, you told me earlier that the quake inspired you to become a reporter later on. I know you are still a senior student. How has that experience really changed you in terms of personality or career choices? There was one moment I remember very clearly. So it's the first night after the earthquake. People were lying at the parking lot, and I saw nobody was fall asleep, actually, or fall asleep. And we heard the radio. It's kind of like the first signal we received from the outside world. And the broadcaster was announcing that the rescue forces is coming. So it's kind of like, it's kind of like the silver lining behind the skin and give those helpless people like me hope. So that's the first time I realized how powerful the media is. So. And later on, when I went to the college, in my first freshman year, I went to a lecture. It was conducted by a senior journalist who covered the Wenchuan earthquake. And during his lecture, I heard him talk about what he did and how he used his stories to inspire Chinese people to cheer the nation up in this very moment. So that was the moment I think, why can't I do this thing? Just like he wrote my stories, and I can
wrote other people's stories and to write the first draft of the history and to write some part of it and devote my life to journalism. So that's the reason why I decided to do this after graduation.
Right. Professor Fu Jing, what's your reaction having heard what Xiao experienced and how that experience has changed him?
Well, he impressed me as someone who is paying attention to parts. He mentioned about the very rapid progress in terms of the physical dimension of reconstruction. That is in an area where we are good at. And as the progress is very fast, and we tend to pay less attention to the emotional side. And this is important as we continue into this progress called modernization. And actually it's very important. We have to deeply think about what's the meaning of life, in addition to the sort of physical side we have.
Is 10 years long enough for people to recover from that?
Well, I guess since I personally do not go through that experience, he probably is the one to answer that question. Now, is 10 years long enough for people like you to sort of recover psychologically and mentally from that experience?
Yeah, have people there recovered from it? How have they been shaped by that?
I want to share with you one example. So it's about my mother. So when like last year, my grandmother was in the hospital very badly. So my mother told my grandmother, "You had survived in such a disastrous catastrophe, but right now the small illness,
earthquake,
like earthquake. So even the building collapse didn't kill you. So right now, how can those small illness kill you?" So it's kind of like the mentality we built inside, I think, which is the greatest and most precious asset for us. Is we have suffered from such a huge disaster. Nothing else can defeat us, so can beat us. So that's what I think I'm here. So to share with you is about how we survive and
so
how we
it's
respond.
good to hear people like him survived a stronger person.
Right, right. I think the Chinese people do have that kind of ability to heal very fast. After all, they had little, right? So it's, let me go to Ms. Guan Pang from Chengdu. She, as I mentioned, she is from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. So Ms. Guan, thank you so much for joining us and waiting for your turn. I understand that you are attending a 10th anniversary commemorating activity in Chengdu. What is the focus people are paying attention there?
Well, thank you very much, Li Xin, for inviting me to your program again. First, I would like to express my admiration to the people affected by the Wenchuan earthquake, the government of China, Red Cross Society of China, and all those who help for their resilience in rebuilding lives and communities. I know it is very painful to remember that many of them lost their loved ones, but also I know that the memory of those who perish will always be remembered. Well, today, the government has invited the diplomatic communities and international organizations, and I'm very fortunate to be part of this delegation to come to Chengdu for this commemoration event of 10 years after the Wenchuan earthquake. Today we had two events. So the first one, we paid a courtesy visit to the Secretary of Sichuan Provincial Party Committee to express to him our observations and also to report back. I think to remember what we have done in that time is very important. So each of the selected leaders and dignitaries, international organizations who were there were asked to give some statement. So in the Red Cross, what I did, I have shared, of course, what we have done, the accomplishment, very, very short one, but also to recognize, the very good work of the government, the people of Chengdu, the civil organizations. So we have expressed that and of course reaffirmed our commitment to work closely with the government in the coming years, because as we know, even we have improvement, we have also a lot of things to be done.
Right. Yeah. Expand on that a little bit. What kind of improvements? What kind of improvements do you think China has accomplished, and what still needs to be done 10 years after the Wenchuan earthquake?
That's a very good question. So right after, during the Wenchuan earthquake, if you can see, as I've read in the reports and in my interview with many of our colleagues and people that I've met, there was actually a lot of challenges, no? So right after that, the government designated, the national government has designated the local government to decentralize some of the relief, preparedness, recovery functions, because it cannot be done only at the national level. The local government should be involved. And then the civil societies, right after that also, they receive more recognition, they receive also more involvement and engagement in the work of disaster risk reduction, preparedness and recovery as well. And then volunteer groups were also recognized and encouraged to be involved. And after that, if you can see last year in the JCPOA earthquake, some of the improvements, we have seen that already. Example, the technology that now there's technology to measure the wave of earthquake. So people who were residing 200 kilometers away of the fault line, not the fault, the epicenter, I mean, were given 40 seconds alert that through the television alerted people, and then they're able to escape from their houses. And then people who are near the epicenter, about 90 kilometers, have at least 19 seconds to evacuate. That is very vital for life saving. And that is a big achievement or improvement, I should say, because normally we can't prepare for disaster. And of course the laws, as you can see, the building codes, and many of the recovery effort that we have seen, resettlement of people to safer ground. So there are a lot of things happening. And then of course the government has restructured now, so they have a new Ministry of Emergency Management. So I would also like Li-Shin to talk about not just the government, but also like the Red Cross, what improvement we have.
Really short. I have a 10 seconds maybe to wrap up. Really, so if you can.
For the Red Cross, because they for the Red Cross, yes, Li-Shin. For the Red Cross, because they receive a lot of support, now they have their own emergency response teams, and also they have their POA Chayan. This is the Integrated Community Resilience Program that is not only benefiting China, but they're also moving beyond their moving across boundaries. They are now implementing this in Nepal, in Philippines, and in many countries. So this is a very good, I should say, improvement and contribution coming from that earthquake. So there's also benefit that we can get in disasters.
Okay. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Gwen Pang, head of the East Asia Regional Delegation of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And here in the studio, Xiao Shiyao, who is from Sichuan, one of the worst hit areas, and Professor Fu Jing from Peking University. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li-Shin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. We've got The Point.